I call it theistic science, but it turns out to be not a lot of technical details. It's some general introduction, a general framework in which we can describe or begin to describe scientific things. And so there's a range of topics today, and as I said, it's not so much science, but it's going to touch on to various things about spiritual growth and religion as well, but in a sort of scientific slant to that. So you'll see how that turns out. So the first thing I want to discuss is how we see life on Earth and what its correspondences to spiritual things. We're going to see functions that go on Earth are similar in form to functions that go on in the spiritual world. So we're going to explain the spiritual world and explain the Earth so you can see the connections between them. That's what I want to get to. And then I want to discuss how we act mentally, because in previous evenings I've talked about discrete degrees, and there have been many of those, so I want to explain a little bit how they connect together to produce mental actions which lead into physical actions. And then, once we know what an individual mental action is, then we can look at spiritual growth, mental growth from being a baby to being a child to being an adult to an older person into old age. And because there are many stages, we all think differently as we get older. We gain new skills to think. We ought to. We hope we are. And so it's possible to use these discrete degrees that I've talked about to see what those are. And then there's the question of how spiritual growth connects to religion, or how spiritual growth produces spiritual activity. Because if we just think about everyday things, it's a question of how that's connected to spirituality and religion. So there'll be some general comments there. And then there's the question of what happens after old age, okay? Is there an afterlife, living after the old age? And so I'll discuss using some ideas from Swedenborg about the general principles that govern the afterlife and how the afterlife is connected with the life that came before on Earth. So you'll see why it's necessary to have life on Earth, but then that gives some effects for a long time afterwards. And then those are the main topics, and at the end I'll list some internet websites that I've been constructing over the years that touch on all of these things to do with spirituality and religion, minds, physics, interpretation of the Bible, and correspondences. So we begin with the first one, which is life on Earth and correspondences. And as I said, we want to outline what I call the functional form of life on Earth and spiritual activities. Because we talked earlier about how God is the source of wisdom and love. And so I'm going to talk about wisdom and light. Wisdom comes from God and light comes from the sun. I'm going to show that there are similar processes involved. And so if you read the Bible, read spiritual things, the idea of a bright sun or a bright light always is used to refer to spiritual illumination or spiritual understanding. So the question is why is that? And then I'm going to see the similarities between plants and rational understanding. So it's a big question of seeing what plants do in the ecology of the world, and you can see how that's similar in functional form to the ecology of rational understanding. And we can think back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the first example in the Bible of, no, it's not the first example there. On the creation days, trees and green shoots and things were described. But as well as plants and rationality, we have the ecology of energy, which also comes from the sun, and love, which also comes from the divine source. Now, many people will say that energy is a kind of love, or love is a kind of energy, but what I want to show here, how energy and love are similar in each other. There's a functional form to do with energy, and there's a functional form to do with love, and they're similar so that they correspond to each other. And then we will look at the 5 senses, how humans have sight, hearing, taste, smelling, and touching. We'll see how they are related to the things that you need from a spiritual point of view. And then we'll look at the human body as a whole, just some general principles, the parts of the human body, what do they correspond to as a spiritual function. So I'm going to go through each of these. I have a slide for each of these topics here, and we'll in each of these slides we're going to go through, start either with going through the spiritual process and then give the physical process and see how they're similar, or we'll start from the physical process and discuss the spiritual process and see also how they're related. So we're going to compare wisdom with light from the sun. This is, as I said, a perpetual image, a metaphor, a simile to describe spiritual illumination. Now, this time we're going to start from the principles we had in the previous talks about God being the source of wisdom to see mental things. And that's what we think of as God as the source of wisdom. God is the source of wisdom. God is the source of love. But the question is how? How does that happen? What are the individual processes involved? And the first thing is that we don't actually see wisdom. We don't, but we see things in the light of wisdom. In other words, you can't, if you look at someone, or if wisdom is functioning in someone's life, you can't actually see it. But what it means is that they can see things and understand them in a wise way. So I was saying here is that we see things in the light of wisdom. And then, actually, we don't see, we see things in the light of wisdom. So wisdom comes down, it shines on things, and then something is reflected into our own understanding, which is we see wisdom filtered by specific ideas, and these reflected into our understanding. And this is just like the sun shining on earth. It shines on a rock or a tree outside, and then we look at it with our eyes. This is like sunlight from the sun, because we don't see sunlight. We only see things that reflect the sunlight. And we see clouds. We see the blue sky as the light being reflected or refracted by particles in the sky. And we see light coming from trees and rocks and houses and people. We don't actually see the light itself, but what we see is the things that the light reflects from. And this is the same as with wisdom. So actually we see sunlight filtered by specific objects and reflected into our eyes. So sunlight contains all colors, all mixed in together. And when it shines on a red object, all the colors except red are absorbed, and the light filtered by the properties of the object then come into our eyes, and we see the red light coming. And when the red light comes into our eyes, and with that we see the object that was red. So this is the same as wisdom. We don't see wisdom coming down, we just see things reflecting the light from wisdom. And so that means that it's impossible to tell that you're wise. It just means that everyone sees things, the truth of things, in their own way. And now, if you were to see the truth of logic, or the truth of a religious idea, or the truth of some argument, or the truth of someone saying something about themselves, if you were wise, you can see what that person or truth or an argument is like. And then, because the wisdom shines, illuminates that subject, that idea, that feeling, that object, and then it shines into yourself. And so the eye is the direct use of wisdom. And there are traditional metaphors about insight, illumination, seeing the truth. These are all correspondences that are based on the fact that the way our eyes see things in terms of the light from the sun is the same functional form as the way we understand things by means of wisdom that comes from the divine sun or the divine source. And then this is reflected back onto our understanding. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are processes involved in the light shining on earth and us seeing things that are similar in functional form, or the functions of things are similar. So if we come back to in more detail about how this might work, we can look at plants. Sunlight is also received by plants, and I mentioned plants earlier. If we have a picture here about photosynthesis, we see the light shining down on the sun, the sunlight shining on the plant, and the plant absorbs water and minerals and carbon dioxide, and it produces oxygen, and it produces fruit, plant sugars. So this is a well-known process of plant operation. So the question is, how is that similar? Is there anything similar to anything spiritual in those processes? So I'm going to say that plants correspond to our first understanding, our first rationality. I'm going to explain in details how, well, in some detail, how that proceeds and why it makes sense. With plants, see, now I'm going to describe the plants first and then show the spiritual things in parallel. Plants use light in photosynthesis to produce oxygen. And our first rational awareness uses wisdom to produce that. Our understanding uses wisdom to produce a first general rational awareness. So oxygen goes into the atmosphere. The oxygen spreads around in the atmosphere, and that makes us live. So I'm saying that's similar. If there was a spiritual air, it would consist of the things, this first rational awareness that's produced. Now, if you read Swedenborg, he describes living in the spiritual world in which there is such a thing as air, and the kind of air is different in each place of the spiritual world. And that's because the air corresponds to the first general rational understanding that comes from the divine source of light or wisdom. So, but this oxygen in the air, or this general rational in the atmosphere, is rather general. If we are to use it, we have to breathe in this oxygen with our lungs. And in the spiritual world, we receive this rational awareness by coming in our individual rational understanding. So there are trees, there are general rational understanding which receives the light directly, but we need more than just light. We need food, we need air, and so on. So we're talking about what those things correspond to in the rational world. And so there are several stages in the way in which rational understanding or wisdom comes down to us. Swedenborg talks about the lungs corresponding to our understanding and the heart corresponding to love. So in us, there are things that correspond to understanding and love. And so we want to understand what the functional forms are for our lungs and for our heart, because these functional forms of our lungs and our heart and our physical body correspond in some ways, the same functional forms, A going to B going to C, is the same functional forms as a spiritual process. So on the left here, I have the physical process, and on the right, I have the spiritual process. So once oxygen, which is this first rational understanding, is taken into our lungs, it's spread around the body in the bloodstream. And spiritually, this corresponds to this rational understanding is carried around in us by something else, some other different kind of process. Well, I call it a mobile love, a love of doing things, a love of uses that distributes this rational understanding. Because rational understanding by itself isn't much use. Swedenborg also has the metaphor of rational understanding as like a coin or money. And those of you who know about coins and money will know that you can't live on money. Money is useful, but only because it's an initial stage of doing something else, which actually leads to living. But I'm not going to mention money again. But in the body, the oxygen that comes from the plants into the atmosphere, and then from the atmosphere into our lungs, and from our lungs into our bloodstream and carried around by the heart, is then combined with food to produce energy where it's needed in the different parts of the body. So rational awareness combines with stored loves to produce some individual intentions or desires or actions in the spiritual body. And overall, we say that the energy that started off from the sun, the light, and produces action. And that's That's the physical process. The light and the energy from the sun produce actions in animals who breathe in the oxygen that comes from the plants. And in the spiritual world, desire or the rationality is a means of the desire operating. If you have a desire and you want to do something good, you have to use rationality in order to do something good. And so therefore that produces action. So overall, we see that plants correspond to one particular aspect of spiritual activity. The aspect I'm talking about is when sort of pure wisdom from the sun is converted into something which is more useful for us in our bodies. And I've tried to explain that to us. But I'm talking about the ecology of plants as a whole on the world. We need both. The whole ecology has to make sense as a process, and there's a similar ecology of functional forms in the spiritual world. So that's about plants and rationality, or plants and wisdom. Now we look at the flip side of that, which is to do with love and energy. And I said love and energy are sometimes taken to be identical, but I say they correspond to each other, because love is spiritual and energy is physical. But we'll see that they behave in similar functional forms, so it's easy to get them confused because they behave in the same way. We also receive energy from the sun. As well as light from the sun, we receive heat or energy. Swedenborg always refers to heat, but I think energy is a better way of thinking about this. And it's in the same way that we receive love from God. And the energy that comes from the sun warms the earth. It makes the earth suitable for growing plants, which we saw earlier. We need something like plants. If we had a rocky ground or a soil with no plants in it, that's barren, then it's not a fertile situation. So a rocky mind or a barren mind is to be distinguished from a fertile mind. So energy from the sun warms the earth, and love from God enlivens the creation. And so we talked earlier about the processes, the stages in which love comes through the spiritual world and into the mind and enlivens creation. The fact that God does enliven creation is the basic idea of theism. According to theism, the world is not created and run by itself. Rather, some basic shell is created, some framework which is then filled with love and understanding from God, which then operates as if it were operating on its own. And that has to happen all the time, continually. We saw back on that picture of a plant, it also produces fruit. So this first process of plants that convert the pure wisdom, the pure bright light of the sun, the clear light of divinity, is converted into something that we can actually use. This also produces fruit. And so I'm just going to say that we're going to call something a processed good, okay? Something that's processed that can be useful. So the fruit is something that we also get from plants, but it's not received by our lungs or by our eyes. Eyes receive the light directly, the lungs receive the light via the plants, but we also receive fruit that comes from this. And animals eat and digest this fruit, and that provides them energy for living. And this affections ingest. So the love that comes from God is used by our own desires and the framework of our life in order to enliven the life and do the things that we want to do. So we can always take in the love that comes from God and use it as we want to do things in our life. God seems to permit us to take things from him and use them as we want. This is a part of our freedom to do this. But furthermore, this fruit that we ingest comes into our mind, it comes into our mouth and then into our digestive system. So plants produce something that comes into our lungs, into our blood, but it also produces fruit which comes into our mouth, into our stomach, and is digested, and then goes into our bloodstream by two routes. So our blood ends up having two things that come from the sun. It has oxygen that comes from light, and it has fruit which come from plants, which also get it from light. And this blood has food and it has blood cells which carry oxygen together, and it's moved around by means of the heart. So the heart is something that takes what we've received and takes it to where it's needed. So I say here that these are moved around the spiritual body by some inner love. So I'm thinking of the heart as some kind of inner love which wants everything to be used in a good way. So to some extent, I don't know the details of the loves that are going on in the spiritual world, but by looking at what happens in the physical body, I can see that there are different kinds of motivations that must be present in a spiritual body if it's to have the same functional form. So I've showed the similarities between plant life and rationality, and then between energy from the sun and love. Now we come to the senses. Many of these are probably familiar to you. We talk about the senses perceive, and we talk about spiritual perceptions or spiritual sensations. Most people have some of each kind. And some people can't always distinguish them, but that doesn't mean that they're not two different kinds. And so some people actually, the spiritual perceptions overlay the mental, overlay the physical perception. So they see things which are actually spiritual but are overlaid on the physical. But spiritual things don't have to have a configuration. We just see them and understand them. So the first physical sense is of eyes. We talked about eyes. Eyes receive light from a distance. Reflected light from the sun comes into our eyes. And so we think of spiritual eyes must be similar to that. We can imagine what spiritual eyes do. They receive wisdom that comes with only 1 or 2 steps from the sun into our spiritual body. There are not a lot of processes, intermediate processes. Maybe the light gets reflected around. If it's night, obviously, it's a bit different. Ears in the physical body detect variations in the air that are caused by the lungs of others, okay? In other words, people speaking. When I'm speaking to you, my lungs and my mouth are producing variations, vibrations in the air, and you receive them in your ears. Spiritual ears, what do? They must do something similar. They receive local variations in this atmosphere, this what I call the first rational atmosphere, and these variations must come from others, and from others moreover when they breathe out. So you can actually work out what breathing out means in the situation. It's feeding some air back into the atmosphere that's been modulated by one's own particular desires and intentions. A physical nose detects compounds in the air. It detects very small quantities of particular molecules that tell us whether things are good or bad, tasty or untasty. So a spiritual nose must detect something similar. It detects very small amounts very sensitively and I say good and evil, because it's not always easy to tell what's good and evil if you're looking at ideas that come onto you. But if you have a good nose for spiritual things, then you can detect what's good and what's not good. And so the spiritual nose does something rather similar to the physical nose. Taste. Physical taste determines the compounds being swallowed and digested. What does swallowing and digesting mean in the spiritual body? It means, okay, you can work out, if I talk about, can you swallow that idea? Can you digest that theory? You know, there's a meaning to spiritual swallowing and spiritual digestion, which you can say. It's taking in ideas and trying to use them in one's life. If you swallow them and digest them, then you do use them in your life. If you swallow them and don't digest them, it means you initially consider it, but then you don't end up using it in your life. And if there's an idea which you can't even swallow, it means you reject it. You don't even accept it at all. So taste is part of the process of swallowing. It's determining what's good and not good, while in things being swallowed before they're digested. The fifth sense is touch. Physical touch detects other bodies that are very close. Okay, and you can work out what spiritual touch is when you're very close to other people. I mean, it's rather. I'm just saying that there's a similar function, so that there's a spiritual body which has all the same functions. A going to B going to C, but A and B and C are on one side physical, on the other side spiritual, and so it's possible. Swedenborg gives lots of examples. He has a training in medicine and anatomy before he became a theologian. And so he had lots of ways of writing about the body. He could write about the body at great length. And quite often you got the feeling that when he was writing about the body, he was expecting you to think of the corresponding the corresponding spiritual activities. But in order to do that, you have to have an idea of what food is, what air is, what oxygen is. Swedenborg didn't know about oxygen. What light, we know what light and energy are. So I'm building up to the point that there is a physical body with the certain functions, and there's a spiritual body which has the similar kinds of function, but on a different level. And if we look at the human body as a whole, there are many. I'll go through the different functions, the different parts of the human body, and see roughly how they might correspond to spiritual activities. So the first thing to note about the human body is it's got a left-right symmetry, except for a few things. We've got 2 arms, 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 legs, etc. Only one of some things, livers and kidneys. But Swedenborg says that this symmetry corresponds to an equal reception of love and wisdom. You need both love, you need the light and the energy that come from the divine source. You need them in approximately equal quantities. And left and right are often used to refer to the particular aspects of love versus wisdom, or understanding versus desire, or energy versus form, activity. But these love and wisdom have to be combined. And so this left-right asymmetry seems to be a universal property in the animal kingdom. Actually, it's interesting to think about when it first occurred in the animal kingdom, but I think what I'm arguing is that the evolution of the animal kingdom, if it's going to receive life from God, must have developed this twofold symmetry. And so therefore there's, as well as natural selection, we can have what I call theistic selection, and things that survive better if they have this twofold symmetry, because this is the way they live better. If we start at the top of the body, we can have brains, okay? Well, I haven't mentioned brain so far, but the brain we think of as some kind of overall monitoring and management of the body. It doesn't actually give the energy for the body, but it gives the neural impulses which manage and coordinate the different parts of the body. So I see it as reception. Because there are many discrete degrees, a spiritual body at one stage has to receive from higher degrees. And so we think of the brain as the reception and stabilization of higher levels. It receives the higher levels, and it also provides a platform for the higher levels to exist in a permanent form. That's what I mean by stabilization. The lungs we've already mentioned. The spiritual lungs receive and modulate the local sort of rational atmosphere. And Swedenborg talked about how different parts of the spiritual world have different atmospheres, and people are happy in different parts according to their own rational understanding, their own life. The digestive system we've already mentioned. Senses is the reception and detection of forms. Heart is to do with the basic, one of the sort of inner powerhouses which circulate things to where they're needed around the body. Now, skeleton, you wonder think of all the bones in your body. What does your bones do? If you didn't have, what would you be if you didn't have bones? You'll be a jellyfish, yes. And so I say here, bones, the skeletons are the general firm principles which keep your life in shape. In other words, you may be able to work out this yourself, but you've got to think of it in a certain way, that the skeletons are the very rigid things that have joints, so they move in certain ways, but they also have a lot of rigidity. They have an internal life to them. The marrow is very important, but the function of the bones as a whole is to keep your body in an upright form and functional form and do things. The nervous system, I mentioned earlier, spreads ideas. It doesn't spread energy around. It just spreads ideas or forms, controlling patterns. Now, the skin of our body is very interesting. What is the function of a skin? Can you imagine what it would be like without your skin? You don't have to if you don't want to. So the skin refers to the outermost levels. So it refers to the lower, to the later physical degrees that are the framework that stabilize the spiritual body. So the skin of the spiritual body corresponds to the physical level that keeps it firm and stable. And if you didn't have a skin, your body would fall apart, you'd leak, and you would disintegrate, you'd disperse. So skin is necessary. And then hair is beyond the skin. What does that correspond to? It corresponds to actual actions and power in the physical. And Samson's hair, of course, is a famous way of describing or using this correspondence between hair and physical power. And lastly, feet is what the whole body rests on. That also refers in some way to the physical world, because the spiritual world rests on the physical world, because actions in the physical world provide the standard functional form, the standard sort of containing form which supports the rest of it. But feet are not just containing, because you can move on your feet, okay? Feet move around. And so that I say that the outer levels which determine our spiritual place. And if you look in the Bible, feet are used as something which has to be clean and they've got to walk on the path, etc. All of these things refer to determining one's spiritual place. You can move your spiritual state by means of your spiritual feet. And so I've gone through a summary of different processes in the physical world and different processes in the spiritual world, and I've seen how they're related, that they're similar. Now, you could just say that's a coincidence, that you can always find similarities like this if you look hard enough. But these correspondences only make sense in the light of what I talked about in the previous talks, when we saw there was causal processes. So all of the physical functions that I've talked about this evening are caused by the similar spiritual processes. And the spiritual processes keep their form because the physical process is going along at the same time and select what future spiritual processes can act. So so the way to think about this is that if you imagine a glove surrounding a hand in a glove, the hand is the spiritual body and the glove is the physical body that keeps it into a form. And those people that talk about the physical degree being the vehicle for spiritual life have some idea of this as well. So let's carry on. I want to say that I've mentioned theistic science in the title. There's not a lot of science, because scientists are not really into correspondences just yet. So these ideas, I say, are just the beginning of a more complete theistic science. And in order to make a scientific investigation, we need much more scientific details and predictions about the things that are of interest. Connections between the mind and the brain is a topic of great interest in science at the moment. Everyone's struggling to understand how the mental activities are related to the neural activities. They continually talk about neural correlates of consciousness, NCC, but they don't really know what the word correlation means there. At the moment, it just means they happen to occur at the same time. But if you had ideas about correspondences and causal, discrete degrees, then you might be able to do better. And related to this is what the neural networks in the brain are actually doing. Because we have lots of biologists and neurologists measure neural activity in the brain, and they see various patterns, but they don't know what it means. And then there's the question of whether our mind is distributed through our body, whether it's just in our brain? That's a question that we don't really know. Some people think, some theorists about mind-body interaction are now going to the state, to a theory they call externalism, in which the mind is spread out over the whole environment. So when I see a chair there, my mind is actually at the chair. Now that might have a grain of truth, but then if it's going to go from the brain to the chair, surely it's got to go through my body on the way. And so we have to understand about mind and the body. And because all the correspondences that I talked about were correspondences of spiritual things with bodily things, not just with the brain, we would expect spiritual things to be connected to the whole bodily activity. And then there's the question of how sensation and perception actually work. Because if you remember the causal processes that I talked about were generation coming down and selection going up. And so that actually makes it rather difficult to get sensation, because sensations are physical things causing mental ideas or spiritual ideas. Every time you're in a mental state and you see something physical, the physical must have caused something to happen in your mind. And so you have to imagine in a scientific way how that could be organized. And I'll leave that for now. So now we come to the second of the main topics, about mental actions. I'll just say some general things. I talked about the bilateral symmetry and how you need love and wisdom. And so in the spiritual actions depend on love and wisdom combining, because wisdom provides the form and love provides the substance. I talked about love and substance in one of the first or second lectures. And so obviously you can't have something without a substance and only a form. It's like a triangle with no meat in it. And you can't have substance without being in a form. So you've got to have substance and form together. And furthermore, the right love has to be in the right form, because you can imagine taking all the parts of your human body and jumbling them up. They wouldn't function. So the substances might be there, the individual forms might be there, but the arrangement might not be correct. And so the love and wisdom are both needed. Substance, there has to be the right substance, wanting to do the right things, in a form on the right configuration in order for things to work properly. In the mental degree, mental action, you have to have thoughts and desires. Desires are needed to produce the mental actions, but thoughts are the way in which the mental actions are proceeding. So if you just act from desire without thinking, you probably already know what that means. And if you have thoughts without desire, then you'll probably already know what that means either. That's intellectual, disinterested rationality, which is not very useful. Psychology also has this pair. It talks about cognitive and affective processes. And a lot of the early work on psychology was cognitive, and then later on people realized that affective or emotional processes were needed. So Piaget, for instance, had a whole stages of cognitive growth. Then Erik Erikson came along with a similar pattern of affective or emotional growth, and actually I'll show in the book that they relate, at each level there's an overlap between them, there's a pairing, a kind of what I call a marriage of equals. Love and wisdom have to be married together of the right kind at each level. And eventually mental actions produce physical results, which was good, because mental actions by themselves are not very good. Oh, well, they're interesting, but they don't actually do anything. So now I come to mental growth, okay? I talked about this, in the previous talk about the sensory mind and then a scientific rational and an irrational. And we normally think that we start off as a child or a baby with just being able to do things with our hands and eyes, but later on we think more internally, and then we get more internal thinking. So mental growth is the awakening of new degrees above the present consciousness. And so the question is how that happens. And Swedenborg has some particular ideas about remains, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly more general way. I'm going to say that in order to get a new level of consciousness, we need a framework in order to hold this new level of consciousness. So that means we need new actions that provide a framework So the question is then how you produce the new actions, and this is where Swedenborg's remains come in. He says, these are motivations and desires stored up in your spiritual life from when you were very young, and they're used in order to prompt new growth. You don't think of them as yourselves, but they're used in order as a seed for the new growth. So they can produce new actions, and once you've made an action, then the new life, you can fit into a new habit. And so the new actions must be ultimately physical, because when we went down the level of discrete degrees, we come to the physical, and only at the physical level do we have permanent historical events. That's sort of the bottom line. The very outermost skin for all of creation is the physical level. And so I say physical actions are what are needed to provide permanent changes. And once you've got the physical actions, then new thoughts and affections can be present and effective. They can persist. Because if you just have a new idea that doesn't lead to a physical action, then you tend to forget it. I don't know if you've noticed this. If you just have a dream in the middle of the night, it might seem wonderful, but if you don't actually do anything on the basis of those new ideas, then the dream just evaporates. It's just gone. But if you get taught a new idea at school or university and you immediately have some project to use it, to do some exercises or to think about an investigative activity, then this is a way of forming a permanent framework in which these new ideas can remain and persist. So this is what I say follows from the kind of theism that we're talking about here. I'm going to list some what I call bad ideas for spiritual growth. Now the font here is rather small. The first one, sometimes people think of spiritual growth as expanding one's consciousness or rotating it, looking up or vibrating in a certain way. But even expanding our consciousness to the whole universe doesn't make us to have a new level of love. No matter how big we are or small we are in terms of size, it doesn't produce new loves, because discrete degrees are not a question of size. Another bad idea is belief. It's not just a question of believing something is true, because that's only in the understanding. It's only in the ideas and the rationality, maybe, rather than to do with love. So love and wisdom have to combine to produce actions, and right down to the physical, before you can have permanent changes. And so belief by itself is not as sufficient for spiritual growth unless it's active in your life. You may know that already, I hope so. And similar to that is knowledge. And I say knowledge even of what things that are true. Even if you read the best spiritual philosophy and read wonderful ideas, you may have done this as a teenager, and you think you know everything, but you realize you haven't actually applied it at all, and it's all intellectual exercise. So it's like faith alone, to just have ideas and no application. Similarly, blind obedience by itself doesn't produce spiritual growth, because blind obedience might produce the right actions. It's useful at the beginning to try out new actions, but unless it's fleshed out from love and wisdom together to justify and produce and these actions and then provide a framework to use them in life, then blind obedience by itself is no good. Obedience is only good if it's not blind. If it's obedience from love and wisdom, then that's the right kind. Similarly, good intentions or love. Many people say all you need is love. But the question is, love of what? I mean, you can think of all the sort of things that you might well love. Alcohol, for instance, are not a route to spiritual growth. So when you say all you need is love, you have to immediately ask, what sort of love are we talking about? If we're talking about love of being useful to other people, then that's a step in the right direction. But in order for that to be useful for spiritual growth, it has to be informed by an understanding and a wisdom about how to be useful to other people. You've probably heard of young youth groups being sent off to foreign countries to do all wonderful things because this is the things that they know they should be doing. But it's a question of how to do that is an interesting question. finally, I'll add something a little bit more controversial. Suffering, okay? Suffering by itself is not sufficient for spiritual growth. Suffering by itself is something that happens to us rather than something that we do. There are many cases of suffering, but what is spiritually important is how we respond to the suffering. Suffering is sometimes useful to get us out of ways that are not good and suggest the need for new ways. But just having suffered is not a way of spiritual growth. It's like a widow wearing black after her husband died at the age of 22. She wears black for the rest of her life. She suffers forever. That's not by itself a way of spiritual growth. Okay, now we come to some of the more technical details. Last week, I think I handed out a sheet, but probably no one's brought the sheet again. So I'm going to show the relevant parts on the slide, okay? I think these two boxes were on separate pages, separate slides. So I'm going to give some consequences of these. I'm going to use these degrees, in particular these middle 3 degrees, to describe mental growth from childhood to old age, and also to discuss the afterlife. So I'm going to, on the later slides, I'm going to repeat the relevant parts of this ennead of 9 degrees. Okay? So let's just consider the middle column of those 3. So if you look on the previous slide, oh no. Oh dear. Okay, the mental column is this one here. That's the interesting one, because I'm going to talk about growth of the mind. That's the main focus for the next part of this talk. So we consider just the mind, and the first part of it is the bottom third of that middle column of 3. And this is thoughts of actions, or exterior mind, or knowledge, just simple knowledge about facts. And this is, if we look at what Erikson or Piaget say about what stages of life you are living in this degree, so to speak, we talk about childhood from 0 to 8. And Piaget has various internal stages to this whole 2.3 degree, I call it. It's the second column and the third one down. So in the book, I go into the separate ingredients of this, but for now, I just take it as a whole. So growth starts here. Growth starts at the bottom. The growth of the mind of the child starts at the beginning and builds up this. So the next stage is a rational understanding, scientific rational. And this corresponds to what Piaget calls operational stage, and then formal stage, and then what other people have called the creative stage, from ages about 10 to 25. So this is sort of high school intellectual activity, and then then kind of creative self-motivation. It's learning to be self-motivated, learning to think formally, and learning to do things in a reliable way. So this is the middle degree, and that's, I call scientific rational, because scientific thinking is mostly on that level, and creativity is needed there as well. But what's interesting is that there's a 2.1, a level above the scientific rational, which I call interior rational, which is, the outer one is thoughts of actions, thoughts of thoughts, or formal things, thoughts of love. So as we get older, we think more about how we love. We don't just think about ideas. When we're at university, we might be thinking about ideas, but we're beginning to think about how one loves with one's life. And when you think about love, you think about, first of all, you think about the actions that follow from loving, and then you think about the thoughts involved, and then the underlying motivations. So there are stages in here, in this 2.1 degree, I call it. Piaget and Erikson, Erikson has as some degrees here, which John Gowan has adapted them in a way which I think is more useful. He talks about a generative stage and ego integrity. And then this is where, when you get to this 2.1, this is where spiritual regeneration begins, as you begin to think more about love. Because as you think about love in your life, you notice that some loves in your life are not really what you want them to be. So you learn to distinguish the good loves from the not so good loves, and you learn to choose one rather than the other. Finally, there are levels in each of these that we could discuss, but that would get even more technical. But they're in the book if you want to look at more details. So going up through this middle section is what life on Earth does, okay? From 0 to old age, you end up going through those stages. So the question is how you get to regenerate. How does religious activity begin in this framework? And I want to say that serious spiritual growth begins in adulthood. It's a known feature that when you get to the age of responsibility, late teens, 20s, this is when your actions make those for which you are responsible, and you start to think about love. And before you have any religious or spiritual life, you're in what I call that middle scientific rational. You're thinking about formal things, scientific things, frameworks, philosophical frameworks maybe, but they're sort of airtight frameworks. I don't know if you know what an ideology is. It's a generalized set of ideas that explain everything. And you must have met people who have, Marxism or Freudianism, whatever, are ideologies which explain everything. And those are scientific ideas. Although they should have been scientific ideas, even if they weren't. So the question is how you open up, how you crack the shell of the 2.2 to get to the 2.1. And so you need to open it up. There has to be some way of recognizing that there is some illumination, something from God that comes in from that 2.1, that interior rational, into the scientific thoughts. So many scientists don't think this, but those people that do have had beginning of spiritual or rational or religious life see that they can look to God rather than just relying on their own thought. And I call this day one because if you think of Genesis, on the next slide I'll show all of Genesis, but day one is let there be light. Okay, there's a crack in the roof of the sky, and light shines in. That's the first step of spiritual life. And once you have a spiritual life, you have light shining in, and you see things in the light of that spiritual life. This is what I talked about earlier, about wisdom shines on your ideas, shines on your desires, shines on your life, and you can then look at it in the light of that wisdom and see whether it looks good. And if you see things that are not good, you have to decide not to do them. That's basically what regeneration is. It's deciding not to do deciding not to do the things that don't look good. And in that process, you're deciding to do things, you actually do things, you make new actions which provide a new framework for new interior degrees. And you can go through the stages of those, that topmost 2.1, I call 2.1x, 2.1.1, 2.1.2, and so on. So there are 3 stages there. I call them days 2, 3, and 4. We'll see in the next slide what days 2, 3, and 4 are. But then, I claim, along the Swedenborg, that spiritual growth is completed in the afterlife. It's begun in our minds, but then it goes to that first column, which is where love really is. That's our sort of soul, so to speak. So when we're living on earth, we have feelings, we have thoughts, we have desires, but our activity in the spiritual, that first column, is something that only happens briefly while we're living on earth. We don't actually live in it permanently until we've died, and we'll see why that is in a minute. So I say moving into the 1.x, and I call it, there's 3 degrees there in the first column, so that stays 5, 6, and 7. And so the result of this process of spiritual growth this escaping the scientific rational, and those you know from what scientific rational is, what the image is of Egypt in the Bible is used to refer to the scientific rational. This is why I call this out of Egypt in the title here. Spiritual growth is taking oneself out of Egypt into spiritual life, into the land of Canaan, so to speak. So I've talked about days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We can, oops, no. Yeah, 7 days of creation. Now this is a table, so I can't do it in the stages. So we can see that this is the representation of what the first chapter of Genesis describes happens on these days. The initial stage is without form and void. This is no spiritual form. In other words, we're still in Egypt at that point. We're still in the scientific rational. The first step is light and darkness, is to see that there is light as distinct from darkness. In other words, knowing that good and true are higher than the thinking that comes from oneself. So that's breaking into that interior rational. But once you're in the interior rational, you have to separate. The waters above are distinguished into the heavens and the earth. That's what has Genesis. So that we're separating two things. We're separating the good that comes from God and the good that comes from yourself, and learning to discriminate. In other words, it's about actions, which is the first step. And then, on the third stage, we have tender grass and fruit trees. So then we're acting from ideas. Grass, to go back to the plants we had earlier, grass is green, it receives light, but there's not really any fruit to it. Okay, it's a very preliminary and basic understanding of wisdom. It's the simplest understanding as you have before there are fruit trees, before there's fruit, before you're doing things. You have to begin with grass, but then the fruit trees come. So you're still acting from ideas. And in the fourth state, which is the end of this interior rational, the sun and moon appear. And so we have love and insight begin in our minds. So these second, third, and fourth states are all, well, I think of them as in the 2.1s. They're still this interior rational. And then later on, we have three more states. This is going into the spiritual world, in which we have whales and birds, deep principles and rising thoughts. Then we have an image of God, which is what Swedenborg calls spiritual, which comes from wisdom. And then finally we have a likeness of God, which is acting from love rather than just insight. And that's what Swedenborg calls celestial. So these last three are the growth into the spiritual world. And I said here they're explained in more detail by Swedenborg's Volume 1. So these show that the basic stages that we had, the growth through these stages is a story, it's the adventure of one's life, okay? And someone understood the adventure of this life at an early stage and wrote the Bible using that kind of wisdom. And Swedenborg has explained how these two columns are related to each other. I said that spiritual growth was completed in the afterlife. So then the question is, what is the relation between the afterlife and the life on earth? So I think we'll come to an end soon. So here's my nine-fold blocks, but I've coloured them. There's a sort of orangey green here, actual physical processes, and there's a green, this mental is called labeled green. So during our life, we're building up in these discrete degrees. So we're building up actions in the physical degree down here, because those are the permanent ultimate physical effects, the skin, so to speak, of all of creation. And we're building up the mental degree. I talked about all the stages from youth to old age in building up this mental degree. So during our life on earth, we have actions here, and we have mental growth we have thoughts and affections of all kinds in this mental degree in the middle. But at death, we lose the physical degree, okay? It's chopped off. It's no longer us, okay? So the question is, how can we function if we only have love and mind there? We want an answer to how we would do things, because so there must be some actions that keep our loves together, our personality, our life. There must be something constant in our life after we die in order to make ourselves recognisably ourselves. We can't just go and change into anything arbitrarily. So the question is, what is determining the afterlife? And Swedenborg has an explanation for this, and I've adapted Swedenborg's explanation in terms of the discrete degrees here. What seems to be important, according to Swedenborg, is what are the spiritual loves in our life? What are the loves that have motivated us to do things? And also, according to Swedenborg, the interior rational ideas, this inner rational. He says you have to have formed something in the inner rational in order to have a life of character after you've died, after bodily death. And Swedenborg talks about a limbus, or some inner physical substances, which also need to be formed. So these three things here are the first row of each of those three columns. According to Swedenborg, you need to have the inner love has to be formed, and it's formed on the basis of the interior rational. You have to have formed some religious ideas of your own. So it doesn't matter what religion you have, as long as you've used it to form some religious ideas by means of which you've lived your life and you can distinguish between what's good and what's not good. So it's a universalism in that sense. It's not required of specific revelation, but it has some basic requirements about oneself. You need to have discriminated between good loves and not good loves in your life, and the good loves have to have led to action and form something in the physical. You need to have some interior ideas which enable you to discriminate, and you have to have some initial love which is good rather than not good. So it's a general feature that in these discrete degrees there are causations goes down. So in general, thoughts and sensations follow from the loves. This is what Swedenborg describes the spiritual world as like. And so the way I'm going to represent that here is to say that thoughts and sensations do follow from the loves, but they're not disturbed by physical events. And I'm going to do it by putting those are actually little earrings. So I'm saying that the blue row is things that are constant. The blue row is constant as you go from this life to the next. There's something inmost to the physical, there's some interior rational understanding of what good is, and there's a love which drives it. Those are the things which are constant from this life into the afterlife. But these lower degrees they hang like earrings from the blue row. In other words, the thoughts you have just follow from your mind and your love, rather than just determined by physical. So you're no longer constrained by the actual physical processes, except insofar as they've made this internal structure. So I'm trying to explain what parts of the physical life, what parts of living in the world are important. When you're living on earth and you're going through that middle degree of growth, the spiritual loves on the left are sort of just beginning to awaken. They're not very much alive at all. And in the afterlife, it would be very frustrating, someone said to me, to have only love and ideas not being able to do anything. You know how frustrating it is in your life if you have some good idea about helping, but you can't do anything. That's very frustrating. So I call this a clever combination. So I say afterlife people have the spiritual ideas, and so they have the spiritual loves, and they generate the new ideas, and the people on earth receive the new ideas and then act physically. So that they act in tandem. The heavens, the spiritual world, is where people live with fully awakened loves, and they generate ideas, and then we're living on earth, and many ideas pop into our mind, don't they? We don't plan all of our ideas. You're just daydreaming. All sorts of ideas come into your mind. Even when you're thinking, trying to think logically, all sorts of ideas come into your mind. So the ideas are produced like a waterfall, so to speak, from the spiritual world. They come into our minds, and we select those ones we want, and then we take the ones we want, and we choose them, and then we act on them, and produce the physical result. So the combination together of the spiritual world and the physical world works as a whole satisfactory cascading of waterfall, cascading intentions. And so the spiritual world supply the first stages, and we on earth carry it on out into the ultimate physical actions. So this is what people in the spiritual world do. They manage the loves, they sort out the loves, then they use them to produce ideas which they then use to inspire us to do all sorts of things we might want to do. And that way, we all do something useful, okay? And we all enjoy doing our bit in the process. We enjoy producing the physical actions, because there's a certain power in physical actions, but the spiritual world people like doing things with love, they like producing ideas, good ideas, and suggesting things to people, and they all do something useful. Okay? That's the end. Okay? So I'll say, just before finishing, the 4 talks have been on these topics, and there's lots more details that we could have discussed, but I'm just producing the general principles that we need in order to begin to understand some of these things. We haven't discussed religion very much, we haven't discussed Bible or scriptures, we've mentioned a few correspondences, we haven't discussed the history of religions, we haven't discussed Jesus or incarnation, and then we haven't gone very much into the science side of physics, because there are discrete degrees in the physical and the psychology and so on. Many of these topics I've made a whole set of websites, and these are some of them, most of them, in which there are various topics to discuss. Oops. The book has a website, Beginning Theistic Science, and the General Theistic Science. Then there's various writings by Swedenborg and about Swedenborg, and then there's a big website about meanings of all the books of the Bible, BibleMeanings.info. And then there's a discussion about mind and body and about physics and multi-level causes on other websites. And so, if you go to this beginningtheisticscience.com website, there's a link to talks. If you go to talks, there will be all the slides from my talks, and also videos, links to videos that Claudia is making. I've done 2 so far on YouTube, and I'll do more. And I'm going to blend in the slides as well. So the idea is you can listen and look at the slides at the same time. So you don't have to copy everything down now, but it helps. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have a short break, 10 minutes or so. Have a drink? I need a drink.